40 years ago, it was the staggering vision, wasn't it? A total shield over the U.S.
Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, yeah. SDI.
Aiming to make America totally untouchable by Soviet nukes. I mean, the scale. 1,000 ground interceptors, hundreds in space. It felt like science fiction.
Straight out of it. But, the idea came from a very real place.
How so?
Well, the whole mutually assured destruction thing, MAD, it was about preventing a war through fear of retaliation.
Right. If you strike, I strike back, we both lose.
Exactly. But it didn't offer any actual defense if deterrence, failed.
No.
SDI was Reagan saying, maybe we can defend ourselves, especially with the Soviet buildup back then.
Okay, so fast forward to today. The world looks pretty different. More complex threats, maybe.
Definitely more complex, not just one big adversary.
And now President Trump has unveiled his own, let's say, ambitious plan, the Golden Dome.
Quite a name.
It certainly gets your attention. So for this deep dive, the big question we want to tackle is this Golden Dome the moment that dream of an impenetrable shield finally becomes, real, or is it still just a dream?
That's the core of it. We're going to trace this whole idea right from Reagan's SDI through to the nuts and bolts of the Golden Dome.
Looking at the tech, the feasibility.
The technology involved, whether it can actually work, and of course, how people are reacting to it already. Because there are reactions.
And we've got plenty to draw on, right? News reports, think tank analyses.
Yeah, expert takes, even checking out what people are saying in online discussions, trying to get a full picture.
Okay, let's kick off with that history. SDI 1983, those massive numbers, again, 1,000 on the ground, hundreds in space. You mentioned the Soviet buildup.
Right, the sources we looked at, like one from the Heritage Foundation, really emphasized that. The sheer number of Soviet weapons in the 70s and 80s. It made people question relying only on MAD.
So SDI was meant to change that whole strategic game.
Pretty much. Reduce the effectiveness of a potential Soviet strike. The huge number of proposed interceptors directly reflected how big they thought that threat was.
And then what happened? Things sort of fizzled or scaled back?
Well, yeah. Bush Sr. had brilliant pebbles, still focusing on space-based stuff.
Ah, yes, I remember that name.
Then President Clinton, he scaled things way back. And George W. Bush actually deployed some interceptors, but very few.
How many are we talking?
Currently, it's just 44 ground-based interceptors. They're in Alaska and California, and still zero, absolutely zero, in space.
44. That feels small compared to the original vision.
It does, and that's a point the Heritage commentary makes forcefully. They argue the U.S. is now only barely able to handle maybe a smaller nuclear power.
Not the big players like Russia or China.
Right. They see it as a real lack of progress since Reagan's big push, vulnerability, basically.
Which I guess sets the stage for President Trump's Golden Dome. He even said it's about completing the job Reagan started.
Explicitly making that link.
So what is it? What did he and Secretary Hegseth actually announce back on May 20th, 2025?
Okay, so the announcement laid out this really, really ambitious goal. Protect the entire U.S. homeland. All of it.
Everything.
Pretty much the whole menu of missile threats.
Right.
We're talking ICBMs, obviously the long-range ones, but also hypersonic weapons, cruise missiles, even drones.
Wow. Conventional or nuclear?
Doesn't matter. Conventional or nuclear payloads. The aim is defense against all of it.
That's a massive expansion. And he compared it to Israel's Iron Dome, didn't he? But called it much more extensive.
He did. Which is, well, an interesting comparison.
Because the scale is just completely different.
Totally different league. Israel's Iron Dome handles short-range rockets over a small area. Golden Dome is meant for a continent against super sophisticated missiles, potentially coming from anywhere on Earth or even space.
Yeah, the physics alone seem mind-bogglingly different.
Exponentially harder.
So how are they proposing to do this? Trump mentioned super technology and satellites.
Right, he talked about a massive array of surveillance satellites. And then, interestingly, a separate fleet of attacking satellites.
Attacking satellites for boost phase.
That seems to be the idea. Intercepting missiles right after launch in their boost phase, which is notoriously difficult, but also the ideal time if you can do it.
And beyond satellites, what's the super technology? Lasers.
Lasers are definitely expected to be part of the mix, based on our sources, plus really advanced space-based radar for tracking. The whole concept is multi-layered.
Okay, break that down. Multi-layered means?
It means sensors to detect launches, satellites mostly. Command and control systems to process all that data super fast. And then interceptors ready to go.
Based where?
Everywhere, potentially. Sea-based, ground-based, and the really key part, space-based interceptors, hitting threats at different points in their flight path.
Space-based interceptors. Okay, that sounds like brilliant pebbles again. Or maybe brilliant swarms, as some are calling this new idea.
Exactly. Echoes of brilliant pebbles. But proponents argue the tech is way better now.
How so? What's changed?
Well, things like AI getting smarter, advances in making satellites smaller, maybe cheaper, and that peer-to-peer networking tech.
Like the stuff used in Ukraine, direct communication between devices.
Precisely. The idea, according to some like General Obering and op-ed we saw, is you could have these big constellations of smaller satellites.
Doing double duty. Sensors and shooters.
Yeah, acting as both eyes and interceptors, communicating directly, coordinating autonomously to track and take out threats. That's the optimistic view.
Okay, but then there's the reality check. We looked at an analysis from the American Enterprise Institute, AEI. They bring up physics.
Ah, yes, the absenteeism problem.
Explain that.
Well, a satellite in orbit spends most of its time, not where you need it to be if a missile launches from a specific spot. It's orbiting the Earth.
So you need a lot of them just to make sure one is roughly in the right place at the right time.
A whole lot. The AEI calculation was something like 950 interceptors needed just to guarantee you could cover a single missile launch constantly.
950 for one missile. So if Russia or China launch, say, dozens or hundreds.
The numbers just explode. You'd need thousands, maybe tens of thousands of interceptors in orbit. It becomes a monumental challenge, maybe an impossible one against a large salvo.
That sounds incredibly difficult. And expensive.
Hugely.
Yeah.
And AEI points out adversaries could potentially just build more offensive missiles to counter it, maybe faster than we could build the interceptors.
What about the interceptors we actually have or are building now, like the NGI, the Next Generation Interceptor?
Right, NGI is supposed to be ready around 2028. It's an upgrade for our ground-based system.
But the timelines suggest only small numbers initially.
Exactly. Golden Dome, especially the space part, would need vastly more interceptors than anything currently planned. A massive ramp-up in production across ground, sea, and especially space.
So the AEI take is more cautious. They think maybe defending against smaller threats or weakening a big attack is feasible, but a perfect shield is out.
That seems to be their bottom line. Technically possible for limited scenarios, maybe blunt a major attack somewhat, but a truly ironclad, perfect defense against a major power, they see that as highly unlikely, given the physics and scale involved.
Okay, let's shift to the strategic side of things. The classic argument against missile defense is that it's destabilizing, right? It fuels arms races.
That's been the fear for decades. If the U.S. builds a shield, does it make Russia or China feel like their deterrent is less credible? Do they then build more missiles to overwhelm the shield?
Leading to escalation.
Potentially. It could upset that whole MAD balance. However, the Heritage commentary argues against that.
What's their take?
They basically say, look, countries build up nuclear weapons for lots of reasons, not just because of U.S. missile defense. They point to China's current ICBM expansion happening even without a massive U.S. shield in place yet.
Interesting counterpoint. And then there's the argument that missile defense might actually be stabilizing.
Yeah, that's another perspective highlighted in the AEI analysis, too. The idea is that having some defense gives leaders breathing room in a crisis.
Decision space, they called it.
Exactly. Instead of facing an immediate use them or lose them situation, you have options. They mentioned Iran's attacks on Israel, or the U.S. response to Houthi attacks.
Where defenses, even if not perfect, bought time and allowed for a more measured response.
Right. It can prevent knee-jerk reactions and potentially de-escalate a situation.
Mm-hmm.
So from that angle, it can be seen as stabilizing.
What about arms control? Russia has always hated U.S. missile defense. How does Golden Dome fit in?
Historically, yeah, Russia's seen it as undermining their nuclear deterrent. But the AEI analysis suggests something interesting.
Which is?
That Golden Dome might actually push Russia towards new arms control talks, maybe to try and limit this new system.
So it could be a bargaining chip?
Potentially.
Mm-hmm.
A catalyst for discussion, especially since old treaties have fallen apart. China, though, is a different story.
They're building up their arsenal outside of treaties already. How do they see it?
They likely see Golden Dome as a direct challenge to that buildup, undermining their growing strategic power.
So a spur for talks with Russia? Maybe, but definitely more tension with China.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk money and time. The cost figures are huge. Trump said $125 billion.
You floated that number. We've also seen figures around $175 billion total mentioned.
Either way, massive. Is there actual funding allocated yet?
There seems to be an initial chunk, reportedly $25 billion, included in a recent government funding bill. So some money is starting to flow.
And the timeline. Trump's timeline sounded fast.
Extremely fast. He talked about completion in 2.5 to 3 years, major phase under 3 years, fully operational before his term ends. That's highly ambitious.
What do the people who actually build these things, like the Missile Defense Agency, say?
Their public goals seem a bit more grounded, though still ambitious. Our sources mentioned initial capabilities by end of 2026, fully operational by end of 2030.
Still pretty quick, but not 2.5 years.
Right, and even that 2030 date, some analysts think that might be optimistic given the tech challenges and scale.
So likely a very long, very expensive project. What about the politics? Does something this big need support from both parties to survive long term?
Absolutely. A project of this scale and duration, it almost certainly needs bipartisan buy-in to last beyond one administration.
And is the name itself, Golden Dome, a potential problem there, being so tied to Trump?
That's a real risk, the AEI analysis flags. Tying a massive, multi-decade defense program to one specific, potentially polarizing political figure, it could make it a target for cancellation if administrations change. Partisan backlash is a definite concern.
We've seen positive reactions from some Republicans, though. House veterans, the RSC chairman, calling it America's ultimate shield.
Yes, there's definitely enthusiasm in some quarters, seeing it as fulfilling Reagan's vision, a necessary step for 21st century security.
But then you look elsewhere, like those Reddit discussions we saw. Much more skepticism.
A lot more. People questioning the basic practicality, the cost for a country the size of the U.S., pointing out, again, how different it is from Israel's Iron Dome.
Some calling that comparison just a gimmick, really.
Yeah, seeing it as misleading marketing rather than a realistic analogy. Lots of doubt about the feasibility and the price tag.
And internationally, China's reaction sounded pretty strong.
Very strong. Condemnation across the board, calling it offensive, warning about a space arms race, saying it violates the Outer Space Treaty's peaceful use principles.
They want the U.S. to just stop development.
That's their explicit demand. They accuse the U.S. of an obsession with offensive space dominance. It's clear they see this as highly destabilizing.
But Russia, interestingly, hinted it might actually lead to arms control talks.
That was a surprising element, yeah, given their history. But perhaps they see it as leverage, or a reason to try and rebuild some kind of strategic framework now that old treaties are gone.
A very complex picture. One last detail, Trump emphasized domestic production.
Yes, he stressed that everything for Golden Dome would be built in the U.S. Lockheed Martin is expected to be a major player.
Which plays into economic arguments as well, I suppose.
Absolutely. Strengthening the defense industry, jobs, national self-reliance, those are all likely parts of the pitch.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. The Golden Dome. It's this incredibly ambitious plan, clearly drawing on that old SDI dream, but updated for today's threats, hypersonics, drones, the works.
Aiming for total U.S. homeland defense, using advanced tech, especially in space. But it comes with a huge price tag, a timeline that seems, well, optimistic at best, and a whole tangle of strategic and political issues.
Right. You've got the hope for this ultimate shield versus deep skepticism about whether it's technically possible, affordable, or even strategically wise.
Exactly. We've seen arguments for enhanced security, for giving leaders more options, but also serious concerns about feasibility, the sheer cost, and the potential blowback internationally, especially from China.
So thinking about this whole journey, from SDI 40 years ago to Golden Dome now, what really determines if something like this succeeds or fails? Is it just about cracking the technology?
That's a great question to leave folks with. Is it the technology hurdles? Can we actually build reliable space lasers and interceptors on that scale? Or does it come down more to the geopolitics?
You mean how Russia and China react, whether it sparks an uncontrollable arms race or maybe forces new kinds of arms control?
Yeah, which factor ultimately holds more sway, the engineering or the international relations? And what does this whole push tell us about where national security is heading, in a world with these rapidly changing, complex threats?
A lot to think about there, a fascinating and potentially pivotal development to watch.